Greetings, church. My name is Pastor Baz Basera, and today I am pleased to be beginning this series that we're going to be going through about the canon of the New Testament. The question is, how did we get the 27 books of the New Testament that we have in the Bible today? And there are a lot of questions that are asked about the canon every time we begin to deal with Scripture and the authority of Scripture. Questions like, did the church simply gather together one day, hold a council, and decide which books should be in the Bible? The answer is no. The formation of the New Testament was a gradual process of recognizing books, and it took over several centuries for this to happen. In this short lesson, I want us to look at how that process happened that we call canonizing the Bible. First, the New Testament books were written. And so the first thing we need to understand is that the New Testament was not originally one book. Between approximately AD 50 and AD 95, these individual writings were produced within what we call the apostolic era after the death of Christ and the rise of the ministry of the apostles. Now, Paul wrote letters to churches and to individuals. The four Gospels were also written: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Acts was recorded, and it recorded the spread of the church, and other apostles and apostolic associates wrote letters. And finally, we have the book of Revelation, which was written by John, as history tells us, from the island of Patmos. Now, these writings were copied and they were circulated among churches. They were read publicly. They were taught from, and increasingly they were treated as authoritative documents. And so the first stage was indeed composition, right? The books had to exist before the church councils could recognize them as scripture. The second thing we ought to note is that the early church recognized apostolic authority. One of the important principles used in recognizing New Testament book was what we call apostolicity. In simple terms, was the writing connected to the apostles? Some books were written directly by the apostles, as Paul, Peter, John, Matthew, and James, and others were connected closely with apostolic witnesses. For example, Mark was associated with Peter, while Luke was closely connected with the apostolic ministry of Paul. But apostolic connection was not the only consideration. The early church also considered whether a writing agreed with the rule of faith, whether it was consistent with apostolic teaching, and whether it was ancient enough to belong to the apostolic period, and whether it was widely received and used by the churches. In other words, the church was not simply asking, do we like this book? It was asking whether the writing bore the marks of the authoritative apostolic faith and teaching. A third thing we need to know is that there were challenges that forced the church to clarify the canon. An important development came through the 2nd century with a man named Marcion of Sinope around AD 140. I hope I pronounced that name correctly. But Marcion, or Marcion, proposed a radically shortened collection of Christian scripture. His collection included a version of Luke's gospel and only 10 Pauline letters. And this created a major challenge for the wider church. The church therefore had to articulate more clearly which writings it regarded as authoritative and why. Around AD 180, Irenaeus of Lyon strongly defended the authority of exactly 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we also have evidence, such as the Muratorian fragment, an early Christian list from around the late 2nd century that identifies most of the New Testament books as accepted for church reading. Then figures such as Origen and Eusebius helped document the state of the discussion. Origen categorized writings as accepted, disputed, or spurious. Eusebius simply recorded the books that were widely recognized and those that remained disputed. This shows us something important. The church did not suddenly invent the canon in the 4th century. There was already a long process of recognition that was taking place. And so when we look at the canon of Scripture, it wasn't the church that gave the canon authority. The church simply recognized the authority in which these writings had. These writings were connected directly or indirectly to the apostles and the apostles' teaching, and they had to be widely recognized as being orthodox and widely accepted by the churches all around them. And this is the first segment of our teaching today, and we will continue on exploring how the New Testament canon was developed.